Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our May WMISA seminar. So my name is Melanie Finch and I'm part of the WMISA committee. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land that I'm on today. So I'm at Monash University in Victoria in Australia, and our universities are on the land of the people of the Kulin Nation. So I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Indigenous Australians were the first Australian earth and environmental scientists, and we have a lot to learn from them and their deep knowledge of the Australian land and environment. The WMISA seminar series is about showcasing the amazing work of women in earth and environmental science in Australasia and hearing more about their careers and their stories. As well as the live seminars, we have also found recordings online of seminars from other organisations, and we've linked to them from our website. So that's a great place to see an excellent collection of seminars from Australasian women in earth and environmental science. The live series is on the first Wednesday of every month, so the next one will be on June 2. You can sign up as a member of WMISA to get a notification of the upcoming seminars, or you can follow us on Twitter. So today's seminar is going to be presented by Dr. Lorna Strachan, who is a senior lecturer above the bar of sedimentology, whose research focuses on understanding the way in which sediment moves and is deposited in the deep ocean. She's a prominent researcher in the fields of turbidity currents and soft sediment deformation. She's conducted research into understanding submarine slope dynamics and processes from tectonically active and passive margins around the world. And her research is multidisciplinary, integrating modern seafloor bathymetry and core data with ancient outcrop and seismic data and experimental flume modelling. To date, Lorna has supervised more than 49 postgraduate student projects, which is incredible. So 43 to completion and 6 in progress, whilst at the University of Auckland. So without further delay, I will hand over to you, Lorna.
Thank you. Now, I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides. Yes, and Melanie is nodding. And I'm just going to do something so we don't see all of ourselves. So thank you very much to the WMISA network for inviting me to speak. And Melanie, when you asked about a topic, I immediately sort of thought, oh, I do actually want to share some of my experiences. And this is the first time that I've done anything like this. So it's been a little bit of a confronting experience for me, but I'm heartened by the fact that so many of you have tuned in today to sort of hear a little bit about my experience, but also a little bit of context of what's going on, you know, for geoscience women in Australia and New Zealand. So I just thought I'd take it right back, zoom completely out as much as I could in terms of, in terms of thinking about the planet and thinking, okay, how well represented are women on our planet of nearly 8 billion humans? And as most people do, and they want to find something out, I took to Wikipedia, which itself is a little bit gendered, I noticed. So you get tables of different countries, and I've doctored it a little bit. So countries that I think people will be tuning in from will be looking at. But you can see any numbers above 1, there's a slightly higher ratio of men. And then as we age, women start to outlive the men. But pretty much we're looking at a 50-50 split of men and women on the planet. And as we all know, we're pretty much all conditioned and brought up in some sort of patriarchal society, unless you're one of the 0.3% of the world's population that have been brought up in one of these of only 6 matriarchal societies. And so when I was sort of thinking about this talk and kind of the journey that I went through, and I read a lot of other experiences that people had and spoke to them, I kind of realized, well, actually, we are conditioned by the societies that we're brought up in from birth, pretty much. So sometimes some of the conflicts I think that we as women have within ourselves are actually part of the culture that we're brought up in. And obviously, you know, when people think of power, strength, leadership. Often those are traits that people instantly associate with men, not always, but often. And fairly often we have very well sort of gendered roles, particularly around family life. So then if we sort of take a look at the ratio of women at universities, it's pretty interesting, certainly at the sort of higher education undergrad level. And so these are the numbers that I managed to get. So I tried to incorporate Australian and New Zealand numbers wherever I could, and I'm trying to show the sources wherever I can. So some of them are at different vintages. So it looks, at least at undergrad, that actually the university is kind of dominated more by women. So we tend to get about 60% of undergrads are women. And recently came back from I teach on our major in the third year, and we have about 68% women in our major coming through this year. So I tried to find the most up-to-date statistics, and I'm sorry, Australia, it wasn't easy to find yours. So I have the New Zealand ones here, and I'm sure someone will have the Australian numbers there, but I was able to mine into the numbers in a bit more detail. So at the degree level, it kind of matches what we were seeing up in these numbers here. Then as we get into the honours, so that first year of postgrad, they start to decline a bit, but at masters they pick up, and then at PhD they're a bit less than 50%. So the good news is, I think at university, at all levels of studentship, if you like, from undergrad through to postgrad, in earth science, women, or geoscience, whatever you want to call it, are really well represented. And so if I think back about my own experiences, so I came from the UK originally, and I went to the University of Leeds to do my undergrad in the late 90s. And I managed to find out the numbers for this as well. And so we could see in the late 90s, in the UK system at least, about 57% of undergrads were female. And the department that I was in had some really amazing female role models, including, she was a lecturer at the time, a senior lecturer, Jane Francis. She became a professor, she became a dean. She's now the director of the British Antarctic Survey. She's a dame, and she's now the Chancellor of the University of Leeds. So, you know, extremely high, influential, powerful, strong role models. And the culture, I would say, on the whole, was very positive for both genders, you know, very inclusive, open. And so certainly when I finished my degree, the future was looking pretty bright from where I was sat. Lots of women teaching me and getting to senior positions, and surrounded by my fellow female students. So then I did a PhD again in the UK, and I tried to find some data on this, but more difficult to find than stuff around the 90s. So I don't have numbers, but anecdotally, from my own experiences, the ratio still seemed pretty good. So close to parity of men to women, and things seem to be going quite well. Obviously, there are challenges with being a PhD student around supervision, drive, etc. But things were going quite well. So, you know, I published a paper, I won some awards at conferences, and I'd say that I genuinely felt that I was kind of on a par with all of my colleagues, both male and female. So kind of echoing what's going on today in Australian and New Zealand universities for female students. So if we then look at the next phase of that academic sort of track and look at the numbers now, here I have the sort of current rates of women in the earth sciences in Australia and New Zealand. And I hope you don't mind, I'm actually not a sports fan, but I went for the sporting colours of the nation. Well, they're not too gendered. So in the kind of gold is the male, and green is the female, and black is the male, and grey is the female. So, but interestingly, both countries had a fairly similar proportion in academia and earth sciences of around 36 to 37% women. And this is from the superb paper that came out last year by the WMISA team. And Melanie, I don't know if you were one of the co-authors on it, it's great. And so the data that I'm going to show here is from that. So if we start to think about that academic track then in earth sciences and how it changes, we see that we've got quite good representation. So here we've sort of got time roughly across the bottom, across the x-axis and the percentage. So you can see at postdoc, so just to get your eye in, green is Australia, grey is New Zealand. So at the postdoc level, we've got sort of close to 50%, at the lecturer level, around 50%. Then at the senior lecturer level, it starts to drop. Now, I don't know the situation in Australia, but in New Zealand, certainly senior lecturer is actually 2 promotions here. So actually this is 2 levels of academic promotion. So I think the reality of this is that actually there's a big drop off by the time we get to senior lecturer. But the way that this is plotted, we actually see that once we get to an associate professor, Australia's doing quite well. New Zealand's, we've dropped off the cliff, so about 17% women. And then as we get up to professor, there are fewer and fewer, with New Zealand sadly winning the lowest number of female professors at 13%. Now I just put another plot up here just to show you the New Zealand male professor for sort of comparison for this plot. So it looks, to all intents and purposes, that women are kind of falling off that cliff as they get to those more senior positions, but I suspect it actually might be sooner than we think of it being the associate professor, because of the hidden promotion level in senior lecturer. And again, I'm not sure if that exists in Australia or not. So it looks really like a lot of the patterns are quite similar to what they were in the 1990s. So actually kind of, you know, more than 20 years ago. But governments have some very lofty goals. And so the New Zealand government, specifically the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, have the lofty goal that they want there to be gender parity for professors and deans by 2035. And to me, it's really unclear how that is actually going to be achieved. I think lots of people, me included, when I was a student, just assumed because there were lots of women, they would just slowly rise through the ranks. But if you look at this plot over time, it kind of looks like actually women appear to become more invisible with time. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to kind of use the experiences that I've had to date to talk through some of the hurdles that I've faced. And some of these will be quite personal. So I hope I don't upset anyone. I won't be naming any names, but personal to me. And then I want to sort of finish with some of the strategies that I would recommend. And finally, a little bit of a call to arms for you all. So a few action points at the end. So what I thought would be useful would be to take a look at that idealized promotion academic track. And pretty much all promotions are based upon this. And so if we were to plot time on the x-axis versus, let's go for publication and research dollar, those high prestige, high respect kind of outputs, you might anticipate a really nice, somewhat linear trajectory. And if you follow this, you can anticipate that you'll have a really great career, moving up the ranks probably quite quickly. And if you're a high flyer, you know, that curve will be somewhere up here. But one thing to note is that there are no career breaks in this. And of course, men and women have career breaks. So this doesn't work for too many people. But we could also play the game of adding in a few other things. So perhaps we might add in teaching quality or student supervision. And I think people probably expect your quality of teaching to improve, and over time you'll supervise some more and more students. But actually it's really hard to prove your quality of teaching. So we get evaluated on our teaching by students, which is basically opinion, which can be very good, but which means they like you, doesn't necessarily mean you're a good teacher, but it can do. So it's quite hard to prove. So I thought I would put what I think my trajectory has been so far, and I'm going to plot both my publications research and my teaching lines. So and I'll talk through the different stages of the career, so I think you can kind of then understand the context of this curve. So to say, it's certainly not been a linear trend in terms of publication and research over time, but for teaching I was really lucky that I think I have a bit of a disposition for it, and I really like working with students. So that meant that I've supervised tons of students, and I got really good teaching evaluation scores from kind of the first course that I ever taught. But there have been career gaps as well. So this doesn't fit that nice linear model. And there were some hurdles that I encountered during that time. And of course, everyone encounters them, but this is my platform, so I'm going to share mine with you today. So I'm now just going to run through kind of that timeline and what has happened to me in those 20 years. So the first hurdle that I encountered was actually when I finished my PhD, was that the relationship I was in meant that my personal situation meant that I couldn't move from the city that I lived in. And there were no suitable postdocs in the region where I lived at the time. And so that actually meant, you may have heard of the leaky pipeline over time, where we have females leaving the system. I leaked out of the pipeline. I was one of those, and I left academia completely. And I went to work for a government quango, a bit like the ARC or the Marsden, and worked in science administration for a year. So I moved to a part of the UK known for Stonehenge and roundabouts, and I worked with a group of people that were senior civil servants, so ex-senior civil servants. And so actually, while it was completely out of academia, I learned an awful lot about process and about leadership, particularly from those old school civil servants, and how to be a really good leader. They were excellent. And then I got a phone call one day when I was at that job, seeing if I wanted to do a postdoc for 1 year at a university in the UK. So I was still based over there, and I jumped at the opportunity, and the barriers that existed before were no longer there, so I could move. And I had a few different opportunities. So I ended up having a 1 year postdoc, then a 1 year lectureship, and then a 2 year postdoc. So lots of short, sharp, short-term contracts. And there were some really great experiences. So one, I got to experience lots of different sort of research avenues. I got to grow the network of scientists and researchers that I was working with. So I worked at 2 different universities. I had the pleasure of working with loads of PhD students. So these were huge research mega groups. So I would be in a group with 5 or 6 academics. There might be 7 postdocs, 20, 30 PhD students. So a bit different to the New Zealand scene, perhaps similar to Australia. And I had some teaching experience, which was great. But there were, so any of you on that early career path at the moment, you'll know that awful feeling of that job insecurity. So you've only got a 1 year contract, you've got 7 months ahead of you, you've got to work out where you're going next. And the thing that I found was it was so stop-start that by the time I'd just gotten into the research fully in one project, I was looking for the next job. So I never had time to finish anything off. And I did find as I went on that there was a bit of friction as I grew as a researcher towards becoming independent and sometimes being a bit managed. But at this point in time, I felt my personal researcher, geologist visibility started to reduce, and I started to become an invisible woman. Partly because of the stop-start nature of the jobs, the publication rate slowed, I attended fewer conferences, and at that time for me in the UK, it was very much more a male-dominated environment, particularly even at the postdoc level. So a second hurdle, unfortunately, I had a very unpleasant experience while I was in the field and was sexually harassed by a group of men. It was terrifying at the time, and I spent the field season at the side of my field assistant for the rest of it. This wasn't taken seriously at all. In fact, the person I was working for at the time laughed, brushed it aside. And for me, I tried to look into the data to see about early career researcher experiences, and there's no data that I could find to kind of show me how much of an experience, shared experience this is for people. But unfortunately, what I did find was the student experience, which is pretty appalling. So at the in New Zealand, and I've just picked one headline, I could have picked many. So this is one of the New Zealand universities, but this is symptomatic of any of them. 28% of students experience sexual assault. Behind this number, 15% have been raped. And if we look to the Australian universities, and they've done a brilliant, it's a little bit out of date now, a 2017 review of 30,000 students, and they showed sexual harassment at the university itself was rife. 1.6% have been assaulted. But for me, the real kicker was that almost all of those students did not make a formal complaint. So pretty shocking. So the next opportunity arose though, and I got the lectureship here at the University of Auckland, and this was advertised on Earthworks. So when people ask me how I got my job here, like I literally knew no one. I saw the job advertised, I read it, I reread it, I was like, it's been written for me. I applied and I got really lucky and I got it. And I felt really, really lucky to have that job. As we know, there's not very many of them around. And I didn't question the starting salary because I just felt immensely privileged to have that position. But perhaps I should have. And in hindsight, I was just so happy about having that position. I didn't really question my worth. But if we do look into the situation of pay, well, we have very clear pay schemes in academia. What isn't clear is the level at which people start. And people subsequent to me definitely negotiated up. And there is a gender wage gap in universities. So in Australia, there's 11.7% wage gap, and in New Zealand, 7.9%. And to put that into context, over the lifetime of your pay as a woman, you can expect to get $400,000 less in New Zealand as a female academic, which would be really nice, right? Help pay off the mortgage faster, buy a bigger house, etc., whatever you want to do. So I was a lecturer for 5 years, so at that position. And so I got lots of good teaching experience, good scores, really enjoy it. And I had the privilege of working with lots of excellent postgrad students, and they won an award. And this is Dr. Christine Fildes, my first ever PhD student. I also took on a huge amount of service roles. So I served on national, regional, institutional committees, of which there were many. My research was kind of following the format it had done in the UK when I was a postdoc, which was pretty much me working on my own, which meant it was really slow. It didn't really fit the New Zealand funding system because I'd come from somewhere where it was much more in the hydrocarbon industry. I occasionally attended international conferences, but because I was teaching so much and doing so much service, I really didn't publish much. So I would say at this point in time, I became invisible, completely invisible. No one would really know I was here apart from the students. But the research network started to build, and in 2010 I was hit by, I had a thunderbolt moment, as in a really, really good one. And what that was, and I've asked if I can name check this person, and she said yes. I met a lady called Helen Bostock, who is at UQ now, who was at the National Institute of Water and Atmosphere, NIWA, who are based in Wellington. And she showed me a different way of collaborating, first of all, whereby in the UK, collaboration was typically someone would give you data or money, you would go away and work on it on your own, come back, put everyone else's names on. And Helen showed me there's another way, whereby you actually share ideas, you share the work, you support each other. And it was a revelation to me. And basically over the years, Helen and I built up a number of joint projects with students, bringing more and more people into the sort of team and broadening out what we were working on. And Helen, you absolutely changed like the direction of my career and what I think it is to be a researcher and a collaborator. So some of you will know Helen, she's here. Sorry, Helen, if you're blushing, but it really was a lifesaver and a life changer for me, for sure. So in terms of some barriers, certainly when I was at the lecturer level, I was very much patronized by senior male colleagues. And what I mean by this is very senior male colleagues. So I feel I was given special treatment, for example, with people telling me what they think I should be working on. For example, people that aren't even in earth science or environmental science. I was ignored in many meetings, so often I'd speak up and then my idea would be repeated by someone else some minutes later. And I was literally unable to say no to a task. So I'd be asked to take on a service role, for example, postgrad advisor, huge role. Even if I said no, it was completely ignored. I was harassed by one of my colleagues and wanted to make a formal complaint over many months and urged not to make it formal. And frequently, and probably many of you can relate to this, I was just asked if I was a student the entire time, which at the time I was like, oh, it's great, I've got a great skincare regime. But now looking back, it was like, no, people just weren't taking me seriously. They weren't seeing me as a lecturer. But why did I keep going? Well, I had a self-belief that what I was doing was good. And thanks to Helen and the growing network of mainly New Zealand-based researchers that I was working with and a great network outside of work, like that belief kept me sort of pushing forward. And it worked, it was great. I got promoted. And so to senior lecturer. And so this was in 2012. So I did more teaching. I'm really into curriculum design, particularly field curriculum design, and supervised more students. So we mentioned I'm on 49 students now at Auckland, but in total I've supervised 65. So since when I was at the postdoc years. And for some people I know that will be the total amount of students or more than they may supervise in their entire career. But for me, this is the part of the job that I love, but I'm being very strategic about the projects that I offer my students, and they fit within this broader framework of my research program. So initially I did it quite organically, and now it's a bit more tactical. Continue to develop and build those collaborations in the marine geology group with particularly trusted, positive, and ultimately friends that I'm working with. Lucky to get a number of the students involved in several voyages aboard the research vessel Tongaroa, which is NIWA's ship. Fantastic opportunities for them to really get involved in some real research. And the paper productivity is slowly increasing, which is more thanks to the network of brilliant researchers that I'm working with. wrote lots of proposals, and some got funded at this point in time, but normally when I was an associate investigator. And people did start to listen to me in meetings, and I don't think it's because I got promoted. I think it's because I just persevered and persisted with sharing my thoughts and ideas and thinking, I've got really good ideas, I'm going to share them. So then I had a couple of other hurdles, which I don't want to call hurdles, but I did have 2 parental career breaks, and over a space of 3 or 4 years in total, and that certainly affected research momentum. I was overlooked for some publications while I was on maternity leave. I don't think for any harsh reasons, I just think out of sight, out of mind. And once I returned to work, I tried to go to international conferences, and I actually reached my lowest point, I'd say, in my career was when I traveled to North America for a well-known large meeting in San Francisco. Many of you all know what that is. And they had set up at the conference something called a mother's room where you could go and express your breast milk. I traveled there with my 1-year-old so that I could feed him. So I met up with him to go there, and there was no room in there to actually sit there and feed my infant son. Words matter. So because it was called a mother's room, my husband couldn't come in there. So in New Zealand, they're called parent rooms. So the lowest point was actually sitting in a McDonald's toilet in a mall next to the conference room, conference facilities, feeding my infant son and thinking, this is just too hard. So that was a real low for me. And so because of the difficulty with that, it's been really hard to go on residential trips, and I'm the primary caregiver for our 2 children. But when I came back from my second period of parental leave, so first of all, I just want to say the parental leave periods were, for me, the best. Like, I completely switched off from work and focused on my family. But what it meant was when I came back from my parental leaves, my creativity was just stratospheric. So I felt like my research creativity was just at a different level than it had ever been. And so that meant when I came back from my second bout of leave, I was very strategic about what I did. So I set up things in the research, teaching and supervision space that would help me get back into it quickly. And mainly that meant working with people that I really liked and trusted. So saying yes to opportunities that excited me and saying no to those that didn't. Because when you return to work, when you have a young baby, you have 2 jobs at that point in time. You are looking after a young baby and you are working full time. You can't take too much else on. So some of you might know that I'm on Twitter. Some of you might know, yes, you are on Twitter. You've got virtual Tourette's. So I'm not going to apologize for that. I certainly increased my Twitter engagement, really just to let people know what I'm doing, that I'm still here, that I'm doing stuff. I made basically the choice to continue to nurture the students and particularly to support early career researchers. And in this picture that I'm showing you here is one of the research projects I'm involved with called Project East, where I'm working with 4 amazing early career researchers. And after having children, I now see how difficult it is for a woman in academia. And so I now actively support and promote other women. I am not just doing it passively anymore. So what does that mean? That means I nominate women for awards. I make sure women are co-authored on papers. Normally they're leading them with me. I write references for women. When I write my reference list in a paper, I make sure that I cite lots of women. And if I'm on a committee and asked for people to go on those committees, I try and recommend men as well. So in 2019, I had my first female boss, who I just mentioned this to her today. So my whole working life, so pre-university, so since the age of 16, I've only ever had a male boss. And I don't know if it was because of this change, but something changed. I started to get recognized for all the work that I'd been doing. So bear in mind, I'd been working really hard for 12 years at this point and not getting much recognition. But I was recognized in my department as being a good teacher. So I got an award for teaching. I was recognized as being a good researcher. Having tried 8 times over 12 years, I eventually came up with a good research idea and wrote a decent proposal that got funded. And I was recognized as a good speaker at a conference. So for me, being recognized after 12 years of almost, being an anonymous, invisible worker was great. But there have also been some really bad things in the last couple of years. One of those was I was threatened with rape while at work, which was, as you can imagine, a very traumatic, hideous experience. I had some very mixed responses. So the immediate people that I worked with were fantastic. The senior part of the university, less so. The police got involved, and it turned out this was part of a sort of calculated national threat to a group of academic women. Also, lockdown has been pretty bad, particularly in terms of workload, and I'm sure all of you understand this. But particularly when you've got very young children or children who are at school, so you're essentially going from doing your normal job to then doing 3 jobs. So homeschooling, looking after your kids, and working full time. And while in New Zealand and Australia, we've been really lucky, our lockdowns haven't been very long. Well, if you live in Melbourne, you might not think that, but for everyone else, but certainly I have found since lockdown, that barrier between home and work disappeared, and I'm working more and more than I ever have. And I follow on Instagram this amazing lady called Bazoma St. John. She's the chief marketing officer at Netflix, and she's fantastic. So if any of you want to follow an inspirational lead woman, she's the one. But she put this post up the other day, and it really hit home. I've been working too much, too hard, not having enough barriers between home and work. So you can't give your life more time. So give the time you have left more life. And that really resonated with me. I'm not there yet. And I started to encounter something new as I started to be a bit more recognized. And this is a bit more sort of obvious misogyny with some of my colleagues. And an article came out fairly recently, last month, I think, on this, whereby some male colleagues are fantastic mentors for young women, but they find it more challenging when the women that they're working with are either at the same level or are higher up above them. And this article, if any of you are interested in this and want to read it, is eye-opening. And while I'm certainly not at a senior level, I'm very much middle, I can see this happening to my senior colleagues as well. And it's I'd say, intolerable. So let's call for some strategies then. So, and a call to arms then. So first of all, so my top tip is just be yourself. If you dress funny, you've got crazy hair, don't worry about it. Just go with it. You are you, be yourself. I would suggest you actively connect, support, and build a network of trusted people. Now that might be women, it might be male allies, men and women, whoever they are. Build that network, they'll be there for you. Wherever possible, I try to actively promote and recognize, and you need some self-belief. So wherever you are, you're there for a really good reason. So whenever you waver, just go back to thinking, yeah, I'm here for a reason, I deserve this. Oh, I've put in a trusted network. As a woman, you need to understand your legal rights around, for example, taking maternity leave, your rights to return to work, and you need to understand the system. Now, yes, this is a picture of me doing weightlifting. This is one of my hobbies. And I do this because I think we've got a lot of weight to lift. So this is the call to arms, really. And I actually think we all need some sort of cultural reprogramming, and I'm including myself in this. So we need to be aware how deeply our patriarchal sort of upbringing, society and culture affects almost everything we do. So we need to be really aware that actually some men use women to help them get to where they are. And also, you might be like, oh, they've just got an unconscious bias and they just prefer to work with men. That's just a really, really nice, polite way of saying, no, that's actually, they're just being lazy sexists, or we could say racists. So I think we need to break that cycle and challenge ourselves and our colleagues to call out bad behavior, call out those male panel groups and awards. And actually, we all know the diversity is a strength. There are some fantastic initiatives out there. So there are women leadership programs, there are women networks such as the WMISA. And for those small amount of women who have reached the top, you've done so through adversity to get there. And actually the structure beneath you needs to change. And I've got an idea of one way of doing that, and there are many. But one thing we haven't really talked about is the elephant in the room, or should I say the baby in the room. And that is that we are different from our male counterparts, because 80% of women have some sort of carer responsibility, whether that's rearing children, looking after elderly parents, looking after family members. And on top of that, most of us carry the household mental load. So by that, what I mean is most of us organize our homes, which is basically we have two jobs. And the pandemic really brought that difference into focus. So for example, in the lockdown that we had in New Zealand, the numbers aren't big, New Zealand is small, 11,000 people lost their job in that lockdown. 10,000 of them were women. This is obviously still continuing around the globe. And for example, less than a day ago, this article was published in The Guardian showing how women are facing significant job risks over COVID, the worst of any level of any previous recessions. And so what I mean by the elephant in the room is there needs to be some sort of systematic change that allows people to have that duality of both being a carer, and I'm not just saying women here, men are also carers, and have a career at the same time. And for me, the most obvious thing is looking at the flexible working laws that exist. And I've gone through and had a look at the laws for New Zealand and for Australia, and they're pretty similar. So in New Zealand, and this is fairly old, this came into being in 2007. So every employee has the right to request flexible working, and the employer has a duty to consider it, but they don't have to say yes. So what can it be? It could be flexible hours, week patterns, yearly patterns, it can be job shares, it can be a range of things. These are the Australian acts, and so what the flexible working arrangement there is fairly similar, but only a certain proportion of the country can apply for it. Similar issues are raising their head in the UK, where people can ask for the right for it, but employers don't need to listen. And one of the people that I follow, someone called Anna Whitehouse, she goes by the name of Mother Pucker, has basically dedicated her life to increasing flexible working for women, so much so that legislation is being heard in the Houses of Parliament over there. And obviously with COVID and the ongoing lockdown in the UK, people have pivoted to flexible working. So they're already talking about this being the model working into the future. So the flexible working models that we have at the moment in law in Australia and New Zealand aren't far-reaching enough, in my opinion, and they need some serious thought and voices to pick them up. So my final message is basically, do we also need to have a little bit of a guerrilla girl movement, like this group of women that have been in existence for 35 years, pointing out sexism in the art world? So I'm just going to leave with that for now.
Thank you so much, Lorna. That was an amazing, amazing seminar, and yeah, it was really valuable and brought up a lot of things that a lot of us have experienced or thought about. So I'm really thankful for that. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording so that if anyone wants to ask questions and they don't want them recorded, then you have, that's what will happen. So it allows a bit more of a frank conversation, I think. And you can ask those questions by typing them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself